Morning, everyone. Feels like the afternoon already. Well done for getting up. Hope you all enjoyed the day. And Neptune's Bellows, I think the timing worked out pretty well that we got to see that as well. And then thank you for coming to the lecture. Just added this bit. We don't always delay it by 20 minutes. But yeah, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my area of interest, which is psychology, and in particular in extreme environments like the ones that we're sailing through. So first things first, anyone have any thoughts about this image? How does it make you feel? What was that?
I like it.
You like it? Oh, thank you very much. Anyone feeling uneasy about it? Sometimes people are a bit freaked out by seeing the icy brain, but this is an AI image generator that made this. And a lot of my pictures, but not all of them, are AI image generated. So we can play a little game if you're finding the lecture boring. Play the game instead. Is it real or is it AI? And sometimes I'll ask you, and you can tell me what you think. So yeah, we will crack on. Anyone recognize this chap? Roald Amundsen. Yeah, and I'd just like to start this off with his quote, "The human factor is 3/4 of any expedition." So I'm going to talk a lot about this stuff as well. Anyone recognize that? It's not ice, as in frozen water. It's isolated, confined, and extreme environments. So the reason that that acronym is in use is that people looking into where humans may go in the future, as in space travel, need to study that kind of thing in isolation, in confinement, and in extreme conditions as well. So a lot of the stuff that has been looked into psychology-wise is to inform future space missions. So we'll look into that a bit today as well. So how do we know anything about psychology in extreme environments already? Well, you've heard of the heroic age of polar exploration. People like Shackleton, Amundsen, Scott, and so on. They wrote diaries and they wrote books when they got home. That was one of the ways that they actually made money out of their expeditions, was to sell the books when they got home. So we know what they say that they felt and thought. Self-report is difficult in psychology. It doesn't always track with the truth, but it's interesting to study. And then proper research started in the International Geophysical Year, which was actually 18 months between 56 and 57. And a lot of the Antarctic bases started to be built in that time as well. So it was international cooperation for scientific advancement, but also to start politically to start claiming little bits of Antarctica. So a lot of bases that we've seen were built around that time, but also furthering the sovereignty claims of those nations. And then I think with empirical research, the voice of the expeditioner is often lost. We like to reduce things down to numbers and stats to be scientific, but it's quite nice to hear what people actually have to say. So let's look at both. So a question for you. What do you think affects human psychology in Antarctica? Cold? Isolation? Anything else? Demands? Yeah. Danger? Distance from family and friends? Lack of sunlight, but also the brackets here are not just darkness, but lack of darkness might have an effect. Different routines, small groups or no human contact. But there are some positives as well. We've all come down here for the natural beauty, for the wildlife, and there's just many, many things that could enhance your experiences down here, I think. So why do we want to know more about this stuff? How to deal with the toll this kind of exploration takes on the psyche, and better conditions for our current scientists and explorers. And then think about also submariners, maybe in the military, and astronauts, as I started to say. So is that real? Yeah. Some of them are fairly obvious, but that was a prompt, just astronaut floating above Antarctica, so it does a good job. And then insight into how humans might better cope with other extreme situations like interplanetary exploration. So in what ways is Antarctica similar to space? Extreme cold, danger and impossibility of evacuation, of course. Small groups are going to have to work together in a confined space, and you need technical expertise to exist in these kind of environments anyway. So you need to rely on other people, but those people, in the case of space exploration, might not be on your ship, your rocket, but they will be back at home and trying to fix things from afar. So you need all of those things above, and it's a dangerous, isolated, confined, and extreme environment. So an interesting point is that we didn't really evolve to exist in an environment like this, certainly not in space, but we did seem to evolve some kind of adaptability. So humans so far are uniquely adapted to be able to move around and explore these places. And here's a bunch of people that did just that. In the heroic age, there are a lot of different expeditions from different countries, and I'm sure you've heard of many of these, the Belgica, and then the race to the South Pole between Amundsen and Scott, and then later Shackleton expeditions as well. So we can start looking at the diaries of historical polar expeditions. At the time, there was very little knowledge of mental health issues, seasonal affective disorder, and so on. They just had some knowledge of an idea called polar madness. So there's a very good book I recommend called Madhouse at the End of the World, which tells the story of the Belgica, the first Belgian expedition. And they struggled a lot with darkness and cold and interpersonal conflict. And that book tells the story of this, but they just knew it as some sort of madness induced by the conditions. Shackleton, he already knew about that expedition when he was conducting his own interviews. He tried to find men that he thought were self-reliant, intelligent, and calm, which perhaps sounds like a pretty good start, although we'll see there's a lot more to it. And then many polar explorers kept diaries, wrote books, and then employed photographers as well, so we can see some of what was going on, and doctors who studied how the men reacted. So in the early 1900s, explorers were trying to understand who might be prone to depression and how that might present itself on trips and impact their teams. And they recognized early that in the long polar winters, people started behaving badly. They knew it was associated with dark winter, but they didn't really know that there was a physiological component as well. They just thought it was just something that they could think their way through. And then when Byrd went to the Antarctic in the 20s, he's said to have taken along, in addition to 2 coffins, a dozen straitjackets. So he had plenty of reading of the previous stories and had something to worry about. Do you think this is a real photo? It does look pretty good, but that was the prompt for the AI was just an explorer writes a journal in his tent. It's getting pretty good, these things. So some common themes from reading through these diaries from all of the different expeditions. Isolation, closeness, and confinement, of course. Darkness comes up time and time again, especially all the overwinterers where they would have months at a time with no sun. Sleep disturbance was common, irritability and anger. And then some sort of fugue state. And I'll come on to this later, so remember the phrase, the Antarctic stare. But there's this idea of a kind of fugue state that can be induced by these points above. And then some kind of intellectual inertia. Maybe today we'd call it dysthymia, like a subdepressive kind of syndrome. And we now know of a collection of symptoms called winter over syndrome, which we see in people wintering through in a base. So I'll come on to that a little later. So back in the day, they just knew it as polar madness, and now maybe we understand things like seasonal affective disorder a little bit better.
Toby, has he got 3 legs, that previous guy?
What was that, sorry?
Has he got 3 legs?
3 legs? Oh, maybe. That's a pretty good way of telling. Yeah. If you want to get expert level on this game, there's a few wayward hands and things later on, you'll see. So Frederick Cook, the surgeon on the Belgica in 1897, that was that madhouse I was talking about. He was the first to spend the winter in Antarctica, and he wrote notes on the trip. The human system accommodates itself sluggishly and poorly to the strange conditions of the polar seasons, and we too are slow in adapting ourselves to the awful despondency of the long winter night. They were pretty good at writing prose as well, these guys. So darkness, cold, isolation, team dynamics, and fear all feature in his diaries. So just looking at a few quotes from these guys for something more specific. This is von Dragalski on the first German expedition. There were occasional bouts of depression in the wardroom. From time to time in the course of the winter, these symptoms grew worse, largely because of the restrictions on movement enforced by the snowstorms and the monotony of the duties. By and large, however, things were not too bad, and improved at once as soon as the fine day appeared and people could go out onto the ice. So imagine a day like today after you've been in pure darkness for 3 months and the restorative effect that could have. So confinement is, interestingly, perhaps not just the physical inability to leave the ship or the space that you're in, but also the inability to get away from other people. Maybe you're feeling that already. So on darkness, Cook again says, a curtain of blackness which has fallen over the outer world of icy desolation has also descended upon the inner world of our souls. Men are sitting about sad and dejected, lost in dreams of melancholy. All efforts to infuse bright hopes fail. The mental symptoms were not so noticeable. The men were incapable of concentration and unable to continue prolonged thought. One sailor was forced to the verge of insanity but he recovered with the returning sun. On sleep, Forbes Mackay on Shackleton's first expedition said he was in pretty fair agony for want of sleep, as we only get 8 hours in the bag and half of that time spent in shivering. And Arctowski, a meteorologist on the Belgica, he recognized both insomnia and excessive sleep as psychological problems, which was kind of ahead of the time perhaps back then. Life on board during the polar night was of great interest from a psychological point of view. Some became nervous, excitable, and sleepless, with the imagination continually wandering and dreaming. Others, more happily constituted, became chronically tired and indifferent. These slept much. And then irritability, anger, overreaction. On Shackleton's first expedition at the beginning of August, so the end of winter down here, Roberts put his feet on Dr. Mackay's sea chest to lace up his boots and was attacked by Mackay, who tried to wring his neck and had to be pulled off. And in a rare example of self-criticism, Bickerton on the Australian expedition admitted to having quite seriously plotted to murder one of his companions. The companion and reason were not stated, but it is thought that the offense was snoring. So just to illustrate what we're talking about in the video that I'm about to play, these are some of the expeditions, and then of course over here on McMurdo Sound, the other side from where we have been, was the starting point for the Amundsen and the British expeditions, the race to the South Pole that you may have heard of. This video tells you a little bit about that history, but it's parts that I've cut from a longer documentary that purely focus on the psychology, the behavior, and the personality of these men. So after the video, we'll have a look through some of those points as well.
Robert Falcon Scott, although an unexceptional officer, possessed exceptional ambition and determination. 32 and lacking polar experience, he nonetheless impressed Markham and was put in charge of the expedition. After a visit from King Edward VII and Queen Alexandria, the Discovery sailed from London on July 31st, 1901 to great fanfare. With 48 men under his command, Robert Falcon Scott was facing an Antarctic unknown that would test his leadership skills. He and his companions would soon set the tone for heroism and suffering in the heroic age. His team for the polar journey consisted of his close friend Edward Wilson, who was the expedition doctor and naturalist, and Ernest Shackleton, a charismatic Anglo-Irish merchant seaman. Although Shackleton and Scott both saw a polar journey as a route to fame and advancement, they had little else in common. Shackleton was as extroverted as Scott was introverted, and his common touch made him more popular with the men. On November 2nd, 1902, the three set out for the South Pole. On December 30th, hungry and beset by scurvy, a deficiency of vitamin C, they reached their furthest south, 82 degrees 16 minutes. A new, if unspectacular, record. They were less than halfway to the pole and had not left the Ross Ice Shelf after 2 months of hauling when they turned for home. In addition to failing in their attempt, Scott and Shackleton were now barely on speaking terms.
Probably a conflict of personality. I mean, Shackleton, who is this larger-than-life, effusive, a very charismatic figure, and Scott, who is the shy, rather introspective in some ways, complicated leader.
As they retraced their steps, it was now Scott's leadership that would determine the difference between success and failure, between life and death in this challenging environment. They had taken the challenge of the Antarctic environment too lightly and were paying the price.
You have to put Captain Scott in the context of the British Empire at the time, and there was a notion that they knew best. The British didn't. They went to Antarctica very inexperienced. None of the men could ski properly, they didn't know how to handle dogs. So they were learning things for the first time, and you could argue that trying to learn things for the first time in Antarctica is a recipe for disaster.
And disaster struck Ernest Shackleton, the toughest of the men, in the form of advanced scurvy. Giddy, breathless, coughing up blood,
Shackleton broke down. He came close to death. And Scott, who was always someone who drove himself, tremendous physical and mental strength, he actually didn't have too much time for people they termed invalids.
A proud man, Shackleton strained to pull his weight. But his relationship with Scott turned as bitter as the weather. Finally, after 3 months, on February 3rd, 1903, battered and lucky to be alive, they returned to the ship which was preparing for another winter in Antarctica. Citing Shackleton's illness, Scott chose to send him home on the relief ship rather than spend another year in Antarctica with a man he may have seen as a rival. After 3 years of unsuccessful forays into business, journalism, and politics, Shackleton cobbled together the money for his own Antarctic expedition. Ernest Shackleton returned south aboard the Nimrod with a small crew in August 1907. He set out for the pole with James Adams, Eric Marshall, and Frank Wild on October 29, 1908. Shackleton had learned little from his earlier trip to the pole with Scott, except that dogs were difficult to handle. His one attempt at innovation was to bring ponies to pull the sledges. They only had value in death.
Shackleton was not a great planner. He was not a great organizer. He was, however, a great man. And he was a great leader. And the harder things got, the more disastrous they were, quite often as a result of his lack of planning, then the better he was. He rose to the occasion.
Shackleton had not improved on Scott's methods, but he surpassed Scott's mark and nearly got to the South Pole. They raced home, man-hauling, starving, within inches of their lives.
I think his huge charisma and his focus helped them get as far as they did. I mean, within 100 miles, considering that technologically they hadn't really progressed much from the Discovery expedition, and technically, as I said, with the body temperatures being that low, they should have all been dead, so it was sheer willpower, and that's something Shackleton really enthused in his men, just willpower, wanting to succeed.
But a new breed of explorer was about to enter the race to the South Pole, and Roald Amundsen, a Norwegian, had 2 distinct advantages. He had lived with the Eskimos in the Arctic, and he knew how to keep a secret. Antarctica had been penetrated by Robert Scott's expedition in 1902 and Ernest Shackleton's in 1909, but not quite to its heart. Once news reached civilization that Shackleton's heroic 1909 journey to the South Pole had fallen 97 miles short of its goal, the bottom of the world was once again a prize to be claimed. 2 men took up the challenge. They were a study in opposites. Robert Scott was planning his second attempt to reach the South Pole. An officer in the hierarchical Royal Navy, Scott was encumbered by the attitudes of the empire that backed him. At critical points in his polar journey, he would place importance on rank and protocol, values which were irrelevant in the Antarctic wilderness. Roald Amundsen brought a modern tactical approach to exploration and competition, gathering an elite team of men for a specific task, to be first at the South Pole. Amundsen received a love of the cold from his newly independent country of Norway. and spent the first decade of the 20th century preparing to be a professional explorer.
How do I think as a polar person? How do I travel in polar regions? I have to learn to drive dogs. I have to be a very competent skier on the sledge. That's going to take some years. He did that. Altogether, he took 12 years to prepare himself as a polar explorer.
He organises his first expedition, which is typical of Amundsen, always ambitious. He's going to be the first man through the Northwest Passage. It doesn't matter that the British Navy has been trying to do this most of the previous century without success. Amundsen, and again this is typical, succeeds. On the process, he winters on King William Island with an Inuit community. He learns much more about the Inuit, about surviving in the polar regions. And he's a good listener and extremely practical.
Amundsen was very fascinated by people who lived in the cold. What kind of clothing did they wear? Why was the clothing loose? How do they prevent perspiration?
In 1909, Amundsen had assembled financing, a crew, and a vessel on the premise of a North Polar expedition, only to discover that he had been beaten to the mark by Robert Peary, an American naval officer and explorer. When Robert Scott publicly announced his intention to mount an expedition to the South Pole, Amundsen responded daringly. He decided to redesign his expedition to go to Antarctica.
And he didn't tell his men or any of his backers because he felt people would try to interfere or change his plans.
Neither Scott nor the public knew that a race was at hand. But Amundsen's team was already working with single-minded focus.
And through the voyage down and their time in camp, each man treated that area of specialty really as a craftsman would treat a great piece of work. They refined, they improved, they experimented, they evaluated. The Scott Party didn't seem to have that clarity on the part of the leader of recognizing what the strengths and weaknesses of the individual men were.
Arriving in January of 1911, Amundsen set up camp in the Bay of Whales, 60 miles closer to the pole than Scott's camp at McMurdo Sound. Amundsen and his men began hauling supplies and setting up food depots for the assault on the pole the next Antarctic summer, November through February. On October 20th, 1911, Amundsen, Olaf Bjaaland, a ski champion, Oscar Wisting, a good handyman, and two expert dog team drivers, Helmer Hansen and Sverre Hassel, set out for the South Pole. Unlike their British counterparts, the Norwegians were expert skiers and were disdainful of man-hauling, preferring to let their dogs pull the sleds. Moreover, the British were strangely sentimental about the use of animals, preferring to punish themselves instead. Amundsen, who would ultimately slaughter his dogs for meat, did not share this sentiment and carried man-hauling harnesses to remind his men that this instrument of torture awaited them if their dogs did not perform.
Part of his planning and part of his genius, of course, had to do with this whole issue of using the dogs as food for both the other dogs and for the men, which was horrifying to the English, of course.
What Scott and his men had in ample supply was iron will, bolstered by the hope that they could beat the Norwegians to the pole. If this were possible, it would give them the strength to make it back alive. Hopes were running high. What lots of things we think of on these monotonous marches. What castles one builds now, hopefully, that the pole is ours. Then disaster struck. Scott and company came across the remains of Amundsen's camp at the South Pole. The Norwegians have forestalled us and are first at the pole. All daydreams must go. It will be a wearisome return. Robert Scott. Captain Oates dryly observed, "The Norskies seem to have had a comfortable trip with their dog teams, very different to our wretched man-hauling." He could not have been more accurate. Great God, this is an awful place, and terrible enough for us to have labored to it without the reward of priority. Now for the run home and a desperate struggle. I wonder if we can do it.
So the real problems for Scott started around January, in part probably the psychological depression of being second. And you see that in the famous photographs of his men standing at the South Pole. I think it had an enormous effect, too, on others who thought that this was going to be their way for personal fame and glory. And secondly, then, they started to feel the effects of cold. And not surprisingly, because it was getting colder.
The British were at the pole a month later, and it was a month closer to winter. The temperature had dropped a critical 5 degrees. Scott's men were exhausted and malnourished. As they began slowing down, they had to reduce their rations so that they could make it from one food depot to the next. None of this was in Scott's plan. The Norwegians, buoyed by their success in getting to the pole, began the race home to announce their news to the world.
So they were doing these in sometimes even 25 kilometers in a day. I mean, just in huge distances. And on top of this, he laid down so many food depots on the barrier on the way back that he said he was at the flesh pots of Egypt. There was so much food. In fact, they were feeding chocolate to the dogs occasionally. They had so much food. So they had vast excess of food, incredible energy. The dogs were in great top shape. The man, the skiing, everything was just cranking. And so he got back in January all the way to his base at Frenheim in the Bay of Whales, and boom, the ship was there and he was out of there.
And I think what got Scott and his men to the pole was sheer willpower. And when they found that they were their second, I think psychologically that had a huge impact for their survival on the way back.
Evans had plans of opening a pub and basking in the afterglow of polar fame. Failure had hit him the hardest. They were midway down the Beardmore Glacier on February 13th when Evans collapsed. Captain Oates recorded, "We found him on his hands and knees in the snow in the most pitiful condition." Evans was comatose by the time they got him into the tent. He died later that night. Oates was suffering from scurvy that had opened an old war wound on his leg, and from frostbite to both his feet.
When he allowed Dr. Wilson to look at them, basically he needed a double amputation. He was in a terrible state. And he knew that they were too far away from base camp for him to make it. And the account in Scott's diary says that he was hoping not to wake up, but he did. It was the 17th of March, it was his 32nd birthday. And he left the tent saying, "I'm just going outside and maybe some time." And that has gone into folklore in British history.
Oates stepped out of the tent into a blizzard. The others watched, knowing that he was committing suicide rather than continue suffering and risk holding them back. They never saw him again. The remaining 3 turned their attention to their own survival and struggled onward for another 2 days.
They were about 11 miles south of something they called One Ton Depot, which is about 150 miles from their base at McMurdo. And then a blizzard hit them. This was in March, very cold. They knew that they were 11 miles away from food.
Driven into their tent by a severe blizzard, the men languished for 10 days as provisions ran short. Scott's final diary entry of March 29th read, "I do not think we can hope for better things now. We shall stick it out to the end, but we are getting weaker, of course, and the end cannot be far. It seems a pity, but I do not think I can write more. For God's sake, look after our people." Their frozen bodies were found inside the tent the next Antarctic summer.
And Scott was in the middle of the tent. Wilson and Bowers were either side of him, and Wilson and Bowers looked very peaceful apparently, but Scott looked like he'd struggled with death.
There were many people who believed that Scott and his team died because of broken hearts. Of course, it is a terrible thing to get to the pole and to realize that somebody has been there before you.
So a good example of tales of heroism and struggle, and just picking the bits there that specifically think about the brain and the psychology and the personality. So the next part is a lot about personality, but maybe you've got a sense of those three men already. And I think a quote from Sir Raymond Priestley really sums it up well here. So the quote was, to paraphrase, something along the lines of, for scientific discovery, give me Scott. For speed and efficiency of travel, give me Amundsen. And when all hope is lost, get down on your knees and pray for Shackleton. So maybe you can get a sense of that from those guys. So looking at the personalities of these men, and just comparing the two British first, Robert Falcon Scott was said to be not an exceptional officer, but he was very ambitious. He was single-minded, and he had a trait that I'm going to go on to explain a bit more called high hardiness. And again, this is just me now giving you my thoughts on the psychology of these men. So you'll have to, take that with a pinch of salt and decide if what I tell you seems to make sense. But I think that this concept of being high hardiness is applicable to all of these guys. He was motivated by fame and advancement. That was his aim, perhaps. And he was an introverted planner as well. So this other personality type of the quiet one, again, something I'm bringing to this, we'll see in a second. So Scott, perhaps both those two. Shackleton was more extroverted. He was understood to be a bit more relatable to the men. He was seen as a common man. And he was very proud and strong-willed, and probably therefore also this high hardiness character trait. Perhaps less of the quiet one in his case. But he was very charismatic and said to be a very inspiring leader. Roald Amundsen was a very experienced skier already. He knew his dog sledding and so on, and he'd been planning and preparing for over a decade. As we saw, he'd spent time with the Inuit. He hired an elite team, hired specialists. He wanted people that knew specifically what they were doing and gave them specific roles. And he was better equipped in general. They had better clothing. They knew how to use their equipment. And so he was very experienced, but he probably also had this high hardiness trait. He had the positive high of being first to the pole, and so their spirits were buoyed and they had extra energy perhaps to get that smooth run back. And in comparison, Scott's party by that time were already malnourished, exhausted, colder, and most importantly, psychologically downbeat and dejected to have lost the race. Here's this quote. So, for scientific discovery, give me Scott. For speed and efficiency of travel, give me Amundsen. But when disaster strikes and all hope is gone, get down on your knees and pray for Shackleton. I didn't do a bad job. So, personality types then. What do we know about the type of personality that is best suited to this kind of expedition, or perhaps to working in a research base in Antarctica, or maybe even those future missions to Mars and beyond? So there's this concept of readiness. You might need to have the psychological equipment to predispose you to being good at these kind of things anyway. And when they've been studied in many, many different studies across time, we see similar things coming up. So enthusiasm, responsibility, and optimistic orientation to the future are all important, as well as determination and the need for self-realization. So lots of positive, forward-thinking, kind of, mostly positive traits. Openness to experience, so that might mean being accepting of how that experience could go and some changes and adaptability. High stress resistance, achievement orientation, wanting to achieve and being more forceful in making that happen, but also low anxiety about the outcomes perhaps. And then also we see this concept of having narrow interests and a low need for stimulation to be quite positive in looking for people that are well adapted to these kind of expeditions or working for a long time in a base. And those rated highest in performance in research bases had low scores on measures of neuroticism, boredom, need for order, affection from others, and achievement motivation. So I mentioned them just now, but we've got these two concepts of the hardy one, the high hardiness, and also the quiet one. So you don't necessarily need to be one or the other. Maybe there's elements of both that are adapted to both kind of things, either working in a base or going on a big expedition. But in Shackleton's case, he did seem to be more hardy than quiet, and the other two perhaps had elements of both. So let's look at the quiet one first. And again, this has been studied, but I'm giving it the name, the quiet one, just because I think that sums up the concept. So this would be a person with low neuroticism, low desire for affection, low levels of boredom, low need for order, and a high tolerance for a lack of achievement, and low need for stimulation. So narrow interest in this concept of being absorbed in your work and not really being too bothered by outside distraction, not needing too much else other than the task that you're currently engaged in. That seems to be a very good personality type and a set of personality characteristics for somebody to work in a base or on a very specific mission. So this is the kind of scientist, the nerdy character that seems to work well and I guess makes sense perhaps just intuitively. The hardiness, high hardiness, it's regarded as a fairly broad personality style with 3 parts. Commitment is the tendency to take a genuine involvement in one's surroundings and the tasks at hand, and to view those tasks as meaningful. Control are the tendencies to act and believe that one's own efforts influences the events that occur in one's life and surroundings, so that you have an impact on the events that are happening. You have control over the situation. And challenge, the belief that change is normal, maybe even a good thing, and that challenge involves the opportunities for learning and personal growth. So somebody that relishes a challenge, relishes the hard work. We've heard of maybe type 2 fun. I think it's type 2 fun is like endurance marathons and so on. It's hard, but you enjoy it afterwards. This is the perfect kind of high hardiness type. So Shackleton, Scott, Amundsen and their teams, would they have had high hardiness? Would some of them have been the quiet ones? So studies into this personality type show that individuals high in hardiness are less likely to show impaired mental or physical health in response to stress, so they can deal with stress well. And a personality test that shows that they're high in hardiness then predicts the successful completion of a very rigorous 250-kilometer ski march over 9 days in Arctic winter conditions. And this is a study done by the Norwegian military. So they are more likely to complete that very hard task if their personality hardiness is quite high. So studies show people with high hardiness show lower biological stress response to surprising and stressful situations, and low hardiness shows a higher level of stress hormones in the body. So that personality type does seem to correlate to the physiology as well. So the hardy one and the quiet one, and we can look at these guys again and just remind ourselves that we think perhaps, if you agree with me, Scott had a little bit of both. Shackleton was perhaps all in on the hardiness, but maybe less of that planning, that nerdiness that could have helped him succeed a little further perhaps. And then Amundsen, perhaps a little bit of everything. And when you couple that with more experience and better planning, maybe that explains why he was first to the pole. So looking at research stations now, Concordia Station is this one right in the middle here, right in the middle of the East Antarctic ice sheet, so very, very remote. And that's a picture of the station on the left. Not a lot going on and not much of a view. And here's another little video of a researcher looking into this kind of things. He's doing many different studies, but also looking into the psychological health of the people he works with. So let's have a look.
Hello world, my name is Toby and I'm ESA's research doctor here at Concordia Station in Antarctica, and I'll talk with you a bit more about how it is to live in isolation here. So Concordia Station is one of the 3 stations in the middle of the Antarctic ice sheet operating year-round for science. For a 9-month period within this year, it's not possible for any transport to get in or go out of the station because of the extreme conditions outside. So I arrived here 5 months ago as part of a 12-member crew to stay for this winter period to maintain the station and continue with science. The main goal of my mission is to implement biomedical research experiments on myself and on the crew. And these experiments have been selected by ESA to learn more about how this environment can be a risk to our body and our mind. You can imagine if we want to plan for future manned missions to the moon or to Mars, it's important that we understand these risks better. Because if we go to space, we have to deal with all kinds of stressors. Deviations from the normal situations, you could say, that ask our body and mind to adapt. And this can have quite some consequences for our health and also for our performance. Think, for example, about bone and muscle loss, if there's a lack of gravity, or space radiation, if we go further into space. It can have serious long-term consequences as well. But also not being able to just go back home if you want to. Being isolated and confined in a small crew and not being able to go outside because the conditions outside are too hostile. This is where Concordia is interesting. So Concordia is quite such an environment. Here we live with 12 people for 9 months without any possibility of rescue. And we are at altitude, so there's less oxygen to breathe in the air. And outside temperatures can go as low as minus 80 degrees at one point, and there will be a time period of 3 months without any sunlight. So in that sense, Concordia classifies as we call it, isolated, confined and extreme environment, which has many similarities with space. It looks a little bit like living in a future space habitat. So the experiments that we're going to perform this year here look into changes in blood volume, changes in our immune system and in our gut bacteria, and how they can impact our health. But also we look at eating behavior, sexual feelings and well-being, and mindfulness, which can maybe be helpful to help us adjust to a strange environment like this. So prolonged isolation can have a psychological effect on us if we fail to fully adjust to this new environment. And you can imagine that's not so easy. It has been described in people that overwinter in Antarctica that they can develop symptoms of tiredness or headaches or sleep problems or problems with attention and memory. But also you may start to feel depressed or more anxious or angry, and there may be conflict between people in the base or even with people back at home. Usually you see that these kind of symptoms are more present during the harsher middle of the winter when the stressors are higher. But if we then talk about long-term effects, you also see when the stresses get lower, when for example the sun comes back, the symptoms get less as well. So we call it therefore the winter over syndrome. But most important, I think, is that overcoming and sharing these challenges together of overwintering in Antarctica can also come with a sense of accomplishment. And you see that people going to Antarctica often see this experience as a very important one in their life. It can come with more self-esteem, we may become better in solving problems and even feel closer together and get a better understanding of each other. And to me, this is the reason that I came here, because I think this is a very valuable experience. Living in isolation, personally, I think it can be helpful to try to create an environment that is a little bit more like at home. So for example, here I try to maintain a daily rhythm that mimics the day and night, even if there's no sun outside. And I try to stimulate my body with exercise, even if it's not possible to go outside and do my favorite sports. I also try to keep eating healthy with the idea that all these stressors is something our body needs to deal with and it could use some good food. Staying in touch with the people at home, with my family and friends, for me it helps a lot. And sometimes I actually do go outside, for example when I've collected samples, such as stool samples, saliva samples, blood samples, and these samples need to be stored cold, so lucky for me that I've got a big freezer outside. But more important, maybe is also to understand that even though this is a new environment, it doesn't necessarily need to be an unpleasant one. I try to focus on things that I can enjoy myself with during my time here, such as new hobbies, and I might set new goals. And then if we are living with other people, especially if those people are not the ones you choose to live with, like here, I think it's important to be very tolerant as much as you can. And it's not always easy, especially when the stresses are high. We tend to think first about ourselves. But to look into the perspective of the other person, I think here is very important.
just to kind of sum up what he was saying there about the station, it's a team of 12 people that are there for the whole 9 months, including those 3 months without any sun. No possibility of rescue there, really, so they are fully self-sufficient. They're actually a little bit at altitude as well. That ice sheet could get to 4,000 kilometers thick in some places, but Concordia, I believe, is about 2,500. And then low temperatures, even down to minus 80 degrees C in the winter. And then 3 months with no sunlight at all. So quite similar, perhaps, to some of those space bases in the future, or more isolated, confined, extreme environments that we're talking about. And then this is one of the biggest stations, McMurdo, just down on the bottom of that map there to the right, which is very close to where Scott started his expedition. So some of the most of the psychological research has been done in stations like McMurdo, some of the British ones, and a few others as well. So just to get a sense that, although the picture's quite bad, this is a bit more of a village compared to Concordia with just 12 people. So syndromes, the two main ones that we spoke about earlier are winter over syndrome and, of course, just seasonal affective disorder. So winter over syndrome is a constellation of symptoms, not a clinical entity yet, but being studied, including sleep disturbance, impaired cognition, negative affect, and interpersonal conflict. And it tends to be worse in the third quarter of the expedition, so starting around the halfway point, but then perhaps improving towards the end. That's called the third quarter phenomenon that I'll look at in a second. And one of the symptoms here is this Antarctic stare that I mentioned before. So this is an idea of almost like a fugue state. People would be seen in the canteen, maybe in the base, just kind of staring out into the distance, and people would try to attract their attention, and they wouldn't seem to hear. And they'd just be in a little bit of a state as though they'd sort of shut down a little bit socially. Their brain was perhaps working a little bit slower, and that's something that's been continuing to be studied, because it seems like the harsh environment has some sort of impact on all of those things above, but also putting them into this kind of state. And then seasonal affective disorder, as we know, depressive symptoms related to changes in the pattern of daylight and darkness. So in this third quarter, you get an increase in negative mood and social interactions during the third quarter of the stay. So actually that should be increase in negative mood and a decrease perhaps in social interaction. And then Rora described 3 stages of how a crew member would respond to a long stay. Initial anxiety over new experiences in the mission, and then a mid-mission monotony and depression as those tasks became routine and nothing much was changing around them. And then perhaps even late mission euphoria and immature behavior as the end is anticipated. They know they're going home and they're feeling excited about it. So elements of these stages have also been reported during long-term Russian space missions and in Antarctic bases. Interestingly, though, many studies don't find that 3-stage model. Some people have more positive mood in the third quarter, so maybe it's more due to individual differences in personality, and maybe that helps us decide how to select people for these kind of missions as well. So winter over syndrome itself includes depression, irritability and hostility, insomnia, cognitive impairment, which includes maybe difficulty in concentrating and memory, absent-mindedness, like that Antarctic stare, and these little hypnotic states. Alcohol issues are made worse by all these things above, so it's a good candidate for screening people to work in these bases, perhaps. And in McMurdo Station, that second base I showed you on the map, people with these symptoms are referred to as toasty. It's a little colloquialism just in that base, and maybe that comes from this idea of being burnt out or fried, this kind of zombified state, or this kind of crispiness, like a hard shell. They're not very talkative, their resistance to being changed or approached. But that's become a pretty well-known thing in McMurdo Station. So this cartoon from their paper, like internal paper, is someone already pretty toasty with his name tag on upside down, looking at the incoming new scientists saying, "Oh, look, fresh bread." So how about group cohesion? Someone mentioned at the start, I think, that living and working with other people and having other people around could be one of the things that is affected by these environments. Polar expedition teams and space crews often experience greater social cohesion just by virtue of undergoing a common experience. But confinement in a small space with the same people for a long time under conditions of danger, discomfort, fatigue, and other stresses is potentially a catalyst for interpersonal hostility, of course. Research has consistently demonstrated that interpersonal conflict and tension is the greatest source of stress in Antarctic bases. So, inhabitants in ice environments often seem reluctant to express tension openly, and that might manifest itself in territorial behavior, withdrawal from interaction with others, and maybe forming cliques along national or vocational lines. So maybe in McMurdo, when there's a larger group of people, people from the same nationality or people working in the same area might perform cliques and stop interacting so much with others. So crews characterized by a clique structure exhibited significantly higher levels of tension, anxiety, and depression and anger than crews characterized by the core periphery structure. So the core periphery structure is more of a one team that have a few satellite people that help to work, whereas the clique structure is maybe a bigger team like McMurdo, where they have larger groups of people. You can't perhaps interact with everybody. So that might cause more psychological problems, more tension to be in a bigger place. So some studies suggest that 12, like in Concordia, is perhaps the best number for a fully functional base. And interestingly, our expedition team is 13. So there's some positive points as well. There's a sense of accomplishment for a job well done, satisfaction with work or progress, and enjoyment of new experiences and enjoying that with your teammates. Many explorers return to the Antarctic again and again. Shackleton tried it 4 times. Amundsen was on the Belgica and then did his own. So there is something about this place that draws people back, regardless of all of those difficulties. And Dr. Macklin, in 21, said the cold, keen air of polar regions acts on the body like champagne and fills one with a joy of living not experienced in tropical or even temperate climates. Both man and dogs gain in bodily vigor the further they penetrate over the circle. So maybe some pretty great things from exploring as well. So this concept of positive things is called salutogenesis, the opposite of pathogenesis. So pathogens, bad things that take away; salutogenesis, good things that could be added on. Stays in polar regions have a significant positive effect for many, and the term was coined as a sense of positive growth and meaning in one's life. So Palinkas and Sudderfeld are the main people that have done a lot of studies, lots of meta-analysis of all of the other studies, and they suggest that these positive effects can be divided into 2 major categories: the inherently pleasurable aspects of the situation and the positive reactions to having encountered and successfully surmounted the challenges of the environment. So again, many people choose to return to Antarctica over a number of seasons, and they experience personal growth and some kind of transformation as a result. So those salutogenic results exist thanks to a successful adaptation to environmental adversities, accompanied by personal growth, maybe a feeling of spiritual and existential change, high enthusiasm, optimistic future orientation and determination, and a need for achievement. So if you have those characteristics, then you may experience more positive growth from a stay in a research base or a hard task like exploration. And maybe this cruise takes away a lot of the hardships and hopefully leaves you with many salutogenic effects. Let's hope so. So what about being adaptive, like this guy with his beautiful hat? People need to be socially skilled, and traits that might be adaptive in one situation and with a particular group of people might not be adaptive in other groups or other situations. So clearly there are individual differences, not only in personality, but in age, gender, education, occupational level, and nationality. And therefore, one can't expect that there would be consistent findings across all of these studies on personality and behavior, or that the same characteristics would be adaptive in different environments. So expeditioners probably need to be adaptive to other people in their team, their needs and preferences, or just any given demands on the day. So perhaps adaptiveness is another thing we really need to take into account, and that is a personality type in itself. Study participants also comment that actually completing psychological questionnaires helped them diffuse some of the stress that they had from their time in a base. And then focus on documenting stressors provides an opportunity to communicate those concerns and a feeling that someone out there has an interest in how they're doing without overburdening their teammates that they have to live with. So potentially just doing a psychological study is quite a good way to make sure that your people in the base are taken care of. And heroic age explorers journaled regularly, so perhaps just writing down their thoughts actually helped them get through what they were experiencing. So what is the perfect explorer? Maybe this guy. And those two that I mentioned who've done a lot of this work say that there are different personalities required for short and long expeditions. In the heroic age, most expeditions had elements of all of these things that I'll show you. And Shackleton had his own ideas that the qualities of an explorer were optimism, patience, physical endurance, idealism, courage, and good fellowship, all positive traits. And Evans, who was on the Discovery and then was second in command on the Terra Nova for the South Pole race, said, "Temperamental folk do not stand the long winter darkness or the close cooping up well. I should think the Englishmen, and I do not mean Irish or Welsh, and Nordic races come out best in the long run." I'll let you make up your own mind on that one. So these guys, these psychologists I mentioned, plus me, because I'm adding in some of my own thoughts, have come up with a list of characteristics for success. On short expeditions, high motivation to achieve and a high sense of adventure, but also low susceptibility to anxiety. Perhaps that is enough for a short expedition. But for long expeditions, and I'm including a long time in a research base in this, the studies seem to suggest that age over 30 does help. Being emotionally stable, having few symptoms of depression, low neuroticism, introverted but still socially adept, satisfied with the social support around them, and not greatly extroverted or assertive, agreeable as a personality type and not aggressive, sensitive to the needs of others, a desire for optimistic friends, high tolerance of little mental stimulation, that quiet one we were talking about, also does not become bored easily, and a high tolerance to lack of achievement. So all of this quiet one concept. A low need of order, and then I'm adding in this hardiness personality type that perhaps we've seen in the explorers. I think that could be a benefit to people working for a long time in a base and in space. A low need for stimulation, like the quiet one, and also adaptiveness. So we had these guys, and we have the concept of hardiness and the quiet one. And then what else makes the perfect explorer? Maybe you can see something in you or in people that you know that could be the right personality types to end up on a mission to Mars or beyond. So have a think. Could it be you on the next one? Thank you very much.